I started actually in a lower middle class family. We're in the semiconductor industry, which is probably the one industry that's defining the future of multiple different end markets and segments. And there's a gap in the talent pool, especially of people from the 30s to the 50s in the semiconductor industry. Curiosity about learning was instilled in me at an early age. And I think I was more interested in learning about nature, how humankind got here, and the universe and everything around it. And to me, it is an inherent quality that I've seen in very good leaders, the value of humility, right?
The thing to remember as leaders is oftentimes we control our own actions. We do not control outcomes.
Look, if any leader tells you letting go of people is not the toughest decision one makes in your life, they're probably absolutely lack empathy.
So what excites you about the future of semiconductor technology?
The AI and generative AI. The problem for humanity, right, is we have emotions of the Paleolithic era. We have institutions that are medieval. And we have technologies that are godlike.
But no, look, I think at the end of the day, develop the next generation of leaders that are part of the semiconductor industry and develop a set of leaders that act ethically, act responsibly, and help foster this great industry of ours to its next phase of growth and success.
I mean, I think the best advice I could give is stay curious and stay hungry.
How many of these self-reliant nations that are trying to achieve self-sufficiency in semiconductors will be successful?
Welcome to today's episode. Our guest is Dr. Sailesh Chittippedi, Executive Vice President of Operations at Renesas Electronics.
With over 20 years in the tech industry, he manages global manufacturing operations, including supply chain and platform development. Before joining Renesas in 2019, Dr. Chittippedi held senior roles at IDT, Connexent Systems, and AT and T-Bell Labs. He also serves as president of Renesas America, boasting 83 patents and over 40 technical publications. Let's dive into our conversation.
Hello, and welcome back to the Semiconductor Leadership Podcast, the platform that dives deep into the stories, insights, and strategies of the semiconductor industry. I'm your host, Salah Nasri, and whether you're an industry veteran or just curious about the world of semiconductors, this podcast is designed to bring you valuable lessons from the brightest minds in the field. From cutting-edge R&D to leadership strategies to global market trends, we are going to explore it all. So, before we get started, I have a small favor that I'd like to ask you all, is please take a moment to subscribe and share the podcast to your community or friends. At the end of the day, the more followers we get, the more interesting and dynamic the podcast will become. And it really helps us keep bringing the best conversations from the semiconductor world. For example, our special guest today. So in today's episode, we are joined by a very dear friend of mine, Sailesh Chittippedi, who is the Executive Vice President of Global Operations at Renesas. So, without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Salah.
It's an absolute pleasure. That's how it is.
Same here.
Absolute pleasure. Sailesh, for me, I see you as one of my angels in life. And the reason why I say that is because when I started the International Semiconductor Executive Summits in 2010, you were one of my first attendees with our dear friend C.Y. Chen in your IDT days. And for that, I am always ever so grateful to you. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Sailesh, look, at the end of the day, I believe that everything where it is today and where it is now in the moment of someone's life, everything had to begin.
Yep.
So with your glorious experience and the marvelous reputation that you have in the semiconductor industry, I am more intrigued to know things about you that people don't know. Mm-hmm. And the first thing I'd like to ask you is what was your childhood like?
Yeah, thank you. First and foremost, thank you, Sal. As I mentioned earlier, right, I'm filled with gratitude as we approach the holiday season for all the blessings we have and for the fact that we're in the semiconductor industry, which is, probably the one industry that's defining the future of multiple different end markets and segments. So let me begin with that. And first, we've known each other actually even before IDT, when I was the CEO of Connection Systems. CEO. And so we'd started with ISIS along at that point in time. So back to your question, where did I begin? I started actually in a lower middle class family, and actually, and this is why I said as we approach the holiday season, I'm filled with gratitude. We grew up actually in a one-bedroom, what would be called an efficiency today, right? And there was 4 of us. And basically, we had one room, which suffices the dining room, the kitchen, and the living room and the bedroom all at the same time. But the thing that was incredibly fortunate was, for me, the value of education was impressed on me early on. And that certainly was a big factor in my learning and the subsequent elements in my life. And for me, the fact that I had an opportunity to learn from an early age and the curiosity that came associated with it made all the difference in terms of defining where I am today. And, Sala, I mean, to be fair, I look back with gratitude at what my parents provided me with, a tremendous opportunity despite the hardships that they encountered, right? We didn't have running water, or we didn't have a phone, we didn't have a television set, none of those things, right? But yet never felt a want or a need for anything as we grew up. But books and learning and libraries, those were plenty. So I think that kind of provided the framework for my subsequent development and growth over the course of not only my educational background, but also my career and how it shaped my thinking and outlook in life.
Wow. That is, this resonates with myself as well. I too also grew up in a one-bedroom flat once upon a time. When one would say is, I don't know, you guys have a different saying that you say in America. But for us, we call it the council estate.
Yeah.
So it's very similar to, I don't know, West.
Efficiency.
Efficiency, yeah, right. And I think, I also had, I've got 4 other siblings.
Yeah, I too, but I only had one. But
yeah, so we had 4 and we were in one room and we used to live in bunk beds, one after the other. One was there and I'm there and the other brother was there and the other brother was there. But those type of experiences were actually, surprisingly enough, the most humbling.
Yeah.
But we had so much fun.
Exactly.
We had less, but we had so much fun. And like now, I mean, we're all well off. We've all got large houses, but that bond.
Exactly. It's disappeared. Exactly.
It's disappeared. And, I look back at the life that I've had at the beginning, and my parents were, I was good at sports.
Yeah.
I was very good at sport, yeah. But they said no sport. Education. Education. We don't care. I had so many opportunities to partake in some good football teams that we have in England, and they were like, no. Education. Is that something that was kind of implemented as well from your parents? They were like, I mean, I loved to read. To this day, I love reading books. But please. What was the impact that your parents put onto it?
Certainly, I mean, I participated in sports, to be perfectly fair, right? And I had, and I'll talk about this in just a second, I mean, later on in high school, I happened to actually be a classmate with somebody who went on to become the captain of the Indian cricket team. And he subsequently became the coach of the Indian team and so on and so forth. But the guy's name is Ravi Shastri. But despite that, right, I mean, sports aside, I think the value of education and the necessity for it to get yourself into a better position was something that was an important aspect of growing up. And to me, to this day, I'm grateful to my parents for giving me not only the opportunity, right? I mean, when you had to go to the library to read books, something that's an alien concept today, it's kind of an experience that one is grateful for. And, I had an opportunity to even go and hear lectures from some of the top scientists and stuff that used to come to the planetariums and so on and talk. And they encouraged me to do that kind of stuff. So it's kind of set the foundation, the curiosity about nature and learning all about it.
Wow. Intriguing. So, I mean, looking at your education perspective and the impact that it's had on you and today, I think one massive problem that is evident in the semiconductor industry is the workforce development.
Right.
Do you think there's a crack in the education system that is not enabling to fulfill these workforce problems that the industry is facing?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you look at the semiconductor industry, right, there was a phase, I'd say, where people started thinking about the semiconductor industry as having matured. And that created a gap in the demographic profile, especially in the Western countries, where you have people in their 50s and 60s that have significant amount of experience in the semiconductor industry. And there's a gap in the talent pool, especially of people from the 30s to the 50s in the semiconductor industry. And I think that gap certainly is being closed rapidly now with the advent of AI and some of the excitement that's coming into the picture. And we'll talk about this hopefully a little bit later. But I think that's kind of created a gap in the demographic profile. And I think it'll take some time to close that gap. But I expect that as a function of time, right, we should be in a position where the short-term problems will correct themselves. I'm fairly optimistic that you will find people back in their 20s, and I already see that in our own company, where kids in their 20s and late 20s coming into the industry again and having an air of excitement and learning about them, right? And I think that's what keeps us motivated, at least in terms of mentoring some of these people to take it to the next level.
Are you seeing the same thing that I'm kind of seeing, that, it seems that one would say the semiconductor gurus are all tapping out?
Yeah.
And either they're retiring or stepping away or whatnot. And you've got the younger generation. But the biggest concern that I'm hearing from the industry, from our members, for example, at the International Semiconductor Industry Group, is this gap that you mentioned from the 30 to 50.
Right.
It's huge.
Exactly.
So how do we fill this? How is it going to be filled?
Yeah, and I think part of it, right? If you look back at my own career, and I don't necessarily mean it translates to everybody else's. I'm cognizant of that, right? I think one of the things that can help fill it is a series of rotational assignments when people are younger in their career. And I think some of the other companies in this industry have done it better than others, where they've allowed people to develop in their area of expertise, certainly have the grounding, but also give them the ability to rotate into different assignments. This is a simple example, right? If you take a wafer fabrication facility, and this is something we were doing, I started doing it within the Renesas environment itself, is to get the younger talent in a factory, for example, that starts, say, in the lithography area, to kind of then do a rotation into the etch, into the implant, into the furnace area. So that way they understand the details about the process and are able to elevate themselves to a higher level versus where they would be if they were just spending 10 or 12 years developing the deep expertise in just one particular area. That's how you tend to develop more of generalists, if you will. And I think what is missing today is probably the absence of the generalist leader that would have the broad perspectives that are needed to take this industry perhaps to the next level. Now, of course, the challenge also is you do need to go deep in this industry, especially to have a foundation. And you just can't quickly move into a set of rotational assignments without having some level of depth, which I think you should plan on doing that for at least 5 to 6 years to develop a deep understanding about a particular subject before you start rotating into other areas. But I think there's hope, there's optimism if we start thinking along things in these lines.
Yeah, fair play. From your perspective then, going back to the source of your passion, one would say. Mm-hmm. So first question is semiconductor manufacturing a passion of yours?
It didn't start out that way.
We're gonna start. So when did you first realize, like, oh, this is it? I got into the industry by accident.
Yeah, me too.
So tell us about your story. How did it happen? How did you just say, oh, this is for me?
Yeah, so no, look, as I said earlier, right, the curiosity about learning was instilled in me at an early age. And I think I was more interested in learning about nature, how humankind got here, and the universe and everything around it, okay? So if you were to ask me what my first passion was, and still is, it's about understanding, about the universe, how we fit into it, and things associated with, the Big Bang, or perhaps what came before the Big Bang, and so on and so forth. But along the way, I got into my PhD program, and here's how the transition actually occurred. I got into high energy physics, which is obvious to understand why that relates to the origins of the universe and so on and so forth. But then I was told it'll take me 10 years to get my PhD. And I figured, well, this is not something I'm going to be doing for the 10 years of my life. So then I moved into solid state physics. And that kind of was the pivot in my career that then got me into semiconductors. And after I finished my PhD, obviously, I had the good fortune of being able to join Bell Laboratories. And I mean, to me, I wish there were more institutions like Bell Labs that I could recommend to people. But unfortunately, there aren't too many of those where you have a remarkable opportunity to learn from probably the best minds in the world, I would say. I can confidently say probably the best minds in the world in terms of what was happening. And that, you could go into Bell Labs, you could talk, one day you'd hear a talk about, dark matter in the universe. The next day you'd hear about lasers, and then you'd have somebody come in and talk about twin tub CMOS technology, right? Which is what I was working on at that point in time. So the ability to be able to learn that was just something that laid the foundation. And that sucked me into semiconductors, quite honestly. And then it became
that's a specific moment, but would you say, was there a person that was maybe involved that inspired you to go, wow, this is cool?
Yeah, I mean, to me, originally, when I started in Bell Labs, I had a great mentor. The gentleman's name was Bill Cochran. And he was very good in terms of CMOS technology. And by the way, I had the good fortune of working with several folks that you're probably well aware of that were also part of Bell Labs at that time, right? You had guys like T.Y. Chu, you had guys, Mark was also at Bell Labs. There was a few other people that were also part of that particular environment. But I had a good mentor in Bill and a few other gentlemen that helped me, including a gentleman by the name of Mike Kelly, and so on, that helped me to develop an interest in the technologies and the kind of impact that it could potentially have in the area. So,
marvelous. So, I mean, looking at the career foundations, talking about those, you hold a PhD in physics from Ohio State and an MBA from the University of Texas. Yeah. So, how did those two vastly different fields prepare you for like the multifaceted leadership roles that you have today?
Yeah, and I mean, to me, I started, as I said, in the technology development area, worked with some tremendously talented individuals that helped, me develop an understanding of the technology. But at that time, AT&T was in a transition, and that time it was AT&T Bell Labs. Today it's Nokia Bell Labs, of course. There was a transition that was occurring where the technologies that were developed within Bell Labs had to be manufacturable. That meant they had created a cradle-to-grave philosophy. And that philosophy basically meant if you developed a technology, you better well make sure that it yields and it gets to where it needed to be. So I was early in the generation that made that transition from development of a technology into manufacturing to make sure it yielded when it went into production. Before that, the technologists would develop technology, toss it over the fence, and the manufacturing guys would be using all kinds of choice words for the inability to get that technology to scale, right? But of course, I had the fortune of working with the guys in the manufacturing to exactly say, hey, these were the problems, and these are the things you need to fix in order to get the technology to yield where it needed to. And that was a great learning experience. And I got hooked into manufacturing and into operations in particular. And I had a great mentor, the gentleman by the name of Dennis Hill, who actually ended up who was in charge of the global AT&T semiconductor manufacturing operations. And the other virtue that I picked, both from Bill as well as from him, was the value of humility. When you talk to either of these gentlemen, right, they were incredibly humble. And to me, it is an inherent quality that I've seen in very good leaders, the value of humility, right? And, more recently, I had the opportunity of meeting Pierre Agostini, who's won the Nobel Prize in 2023. I had dinner with him at Ohio State University. And the gentleman is an incredibly humble guy. I listened to John Bardeen. The gentleman would sign every note that every kid sent him just so that he could be a mentor, right? So the value of humility as you move up the ladder is very, very important, because the semiconductor industry can be very, very humbling given its cyclicality, right? So being taught that at an earlier age with people that have the experience more than you helps shape you.
Wow. That's remarkable to hear. And so your early career at AT&T Bell Labs, evidently, as you've explained, was very transformative. In terms of the leadership styles of humility, what about the leadership style in terms of technical decision-making?
Yeah, I think, look, at Bell Labs, you don't survive. It's not deeply technical. See, it's black and white, right? So I think the fact that you made decisions based on technology and you made decisions based on sometimes, right? Oftentimes, as a leader, one of the things that you have to do is make decisions based on incomplete information. Otherwise, you run into the risk of waiting for all the data to come in, by which time the market's changed in terms of what happens of being late in the market. So I think those two are virtues that are equally important. And I think more importantly, Sal, I think the key thing to me is leadership, one value, one attribute, and I call this servant leadership, is an important virtue to have, right? You lead by example and lead by the values that you bring into an organization. Otherwise, you tend to lead by virtue of your title, and that is seldom inspirational to an organization, right? It is rarely ever going to inspire a team. Just because you hold a title in an organization, it could be temporary, it could be because of fear, but you never lead unless you're a true servant leader in terms of driving the values and the behaviors you need to see in a team, in an organization. And it's ultimately, that's how you form the relationships. That's how we've known each other. That's how, you lead teams.
Yeah, no, valid point. Yeah, so, when I was at Stanford this year, there's one specific area that they said, I can't remember the professor. There's Professor Bill Barnett was mentioning and he basically said that there's a title that is missing in most companies, and it's the CAO.
Yeah.
And the CAO is the Chief Accountability Officer.
Exactly.
And I feel that, from what you're saying from your perspectives of leadership, that one needs to take empathy.
Yeah.
So, and that's one thing I've seen that with you is you have a lot of empathy. But do you also believe that, aside, if you can't get all the data and you need to act on it, how how do you, where does intuition come into play? What's your beliefs in intuition?
Right. And I think it's a powerful, when you go through business school, and as you have, right, one of the things you think is, okay, I've made the financials make sense, and therefore I should do the transaction, right? Where most transactions fail is really in terms of the cultural fit that ends up happening. And if the cultures don't meld within an organization or the ones that you're trying to create, they're doomed to failure, for certain. And I think intuition plays a very big role in terms of sitting across the table from the person to try to figure out, does this organization, this set of beliefs and these sets of values, is that going to work well with what we're trying to accomplish as an organization? And I think that's tremendously important in terms of forming judgment. And I think ultimately decisions that are made, big or small, are based on intuition. And when you're going through your graduate school, you think it's about the numbers and P&L. And as you well know, you can make any NPV positive. You either change the revenue or you change the cost to get to a positive NPV, right? It's a relatively easy decision. But at the end of the day, the technology call and the culture call are the two most important things.
Yeah. Marvelous. Thank you for your insights on there. So now I want to go into, of course, one of the specific parts of your career is at Renesas.
And before.
But from your perspective, in terms of overseeing a lot of responsibility,
yep.
I think Renesas has the highlight in it.
Yeah.
Would you say it was the connection time? Or?
I would say, every aspect of every element of my career has had a major role. And let me briefly walk you through pretty quickly, right? AT&T, obviously, I spoke about it. Connexent was a huge challenge. And what I learned in Connexent is something I will never, ever forget, right? The company was had acquired a whole bunch of companies before I joined. And unfortunately, the revenue was in the decline. And the company revenue was declining. We had to service all the debt. And by the time I became the CEO, it was very clear we weren't going to survive. So I had to go through the process of restructuring the company. And very few companies, about 5% of the companies or so, survive a Chapter 11 restructuring. We were one of the fortunate few that were able to make it on the other side. But the experience of leading an organization, dealing with the suppliers to assure them that they're going to make the payment, keeping the employees engaged to know that you make the payroll, they get their bonuses and so on. And on the other side, assuring the customers you're still in business was an important aspect of it. And being able to go to the courts in Delaware helped them work through the system. So to me, I'd say, I wouldn't call it a highlight, but I'd say the learning that I had is sort of set the foundation for everything that came after that, whether it was IDT or whether it's Renesas. And the leadership that you had to go through, the pain and the suffering that you had to go through with the organization in order to get them on the other side is something I don't wish on anybody, but by the same token, it's something I would say one of the most stressful aspects of what I encountered. Everything else just pales in significance to what we had to go through to get it to private equity ownership and then change private equity ownership. And after that, the IDT journey was an interesting journey and actually is the most pleasurable from my perspective because the company was actually not doing very well in terms of areas to focus on. And I had the good fortune of working with Greg Waters, who I knew at Bell Labs and AT&T before. And the company, we put it through a stage of rapid growth. So growing a company that is not healthy and putting in a few strategic tuck-ins to make it successful was a huge element of what ended up happening there. And then subsequently, of course, Renesas acquired IDT. And I stuck around with Renesas and helped grow that business. So I think, to me, every aspect of my career has shaped what you're looking at. Hopefully not yet a final product, but close to.
It's a remarkable final product, I can tell you that, Sailesh. This is so interesting when you mention this word, and I hear it, and I relate it to myself as well. starting off. And as I mentioned to you earlier, yesterday I was at the dinner with Jensen, quoting from NVIDIA. And, one thing that Jensen always relates to, if I ask him and I say, yeah, what's the toughest thing, or what's the key attribute that you would advise for someone to be as successful as you are? The word pain and suffering.
Yeah, exactly.
How does that play an impact on mental health?
Yeah, I mean, look, to some extent, I think the empathy factor plays a very big role, right? And this is where the notion of EQ being as important as IQ starts to play a role in terms of understanding. Getting an organization to understand, it's going to be better on the other side, and getting the team aligned to that vision of where you're going, right, is a huge element of what defines your success. And I mean, to Jensen's point, there's many a time when he thought NVIDIA was going to go belly up, right? And he was able to articulate the vision to get a core group of people with him. And look where it is today, right? That doesn't mean every company is going to end up that way, don't get me wrong. And we wish we would. But I think in general, getting that core vision of people and understanding that does it take, that there will be a toll in which you have to deal with it, but you can't, at the end of the day, take it personally, right? If you do, then it becomes a little bit more of a stress factor for you. It'll start impacting your health and all the other things. But the ability to have a firm foundation in whatever it is, your belief system, if you will, is what ultimately carries you through on the other side.
That's quite contrary. I mean, as you're aware, the unfortunate health situations that are being impacted due to taking the pain and suffering person.
Yeah.
And having taken a sabbatical and coming back to the game not that long ago, it's made me realize that there's no need to take it personally.
Exactly.
But the thing is, it's challenging, especially when you're at a stage where you have a lot of appetite and a lot of ambition and etc. Unfortunately, you take it very personal at the end of the day, but it doesn't work into favor, especially at a young age. But I think the most important element, this might sound very cliche, is the importance of integrity.
Exactly.
I mean, you can take it personal under the condition that it's based on integrity. However, as you mentioned, it can backfire to impacting your health mentally and physically.
Absolutely.
So, what's your advice to someone in that situation? I mean, I've got my own advice, but I'd love to hear your advice on how not to take it personal, because you mentioned some terms, I believe. Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, look, when you find yourself in a situation that's hugely stressful, right? The thing to remember as leaders is oftentimes we control our own actions. We do not control outcomes. Outcomes are influenced sometimes by external factors. They're not influenced entirely by the actions that you take. So as a leader, if you consistently take the set of actions that are aligned with your own belief system, whether it's integrity, whether it's following a set of principles that you operate to, call it what you will, as long as you're consistent, people see that coming through, right? Where things start to fall apart is if your vision doesn't align with your actions. As long as you're consistent between your vision, the actions, and there's alignment, you will rally the teams. It'll be less personal and it'll be less stressful overall in terms of what's happening. So being grounded in a set of beliefs and values that are core to your operating model or whatever, personal operating model, if you will, is what's going to make the difference in terms of where this journey takes you, wherever it may.
So, I mean, I think what you were referring to is this element of resilience.
Yeah.
You definitely, if I was to own a semiconductor IDM or a foundry, the first person I'll call to manage my operations is you, Sailesh. How have you managed throughout your career to ensure operational resilience in the most dynamic and uncertain environment in the world, which is our semiconductor industry?
And that's a fairly tough question with many dimensions to it, but let me try to simplify it if I can. Look, today the industry is probably facing more challenges than it did in the past. We were in the early 2000s all the way until, maybe 2020 or so. We were in an age of globalization, which kind of essentially meant one thing: operating at the most cost-efficient point in the world. And that led to, obviously, the industry that we see still largely intact today, right? You saw the advent of the fabless model. You saw things being successful. Well, now with the deglobalization, if I can use that word, right, the industry and the geopolitical tensions, the industry is becoming far more complex in terms of how one manages things. But again, right, fundamentally, even in this environment, finding out what makes your customers tick becomes much more important. What is important to them is probably listening to them more than you had in the past in terms of how they would like their supply chains to be managed, whether it's regionally, whether it's cost efficiently, or whether it's some other way, will provide you better context than you could on your own. So the notion of just being purely operational and just focusing on a smaller subset will not work anymore, right? And so you have to be much more broader in your thinking about, for example, a China for China model or some other country's model for its own perspective and developing that. Now, where it gets to be a bit more challenging for industry is, will you get the best cost structure in it? And the answer obviously is no, because globalization has worked for a reason in the sense that people focused on maximizing efficiency wherever that happened to be, right? Obviously, if you start breaking that model up, then you get into a higher cost structure model. And a lot of the customers don't understand that readily, right? They would like to still maintain the advantages of the models of yesteryear and still get the benefits of geopolitical diversity, if you will, in terms of what happens. So figuring that out for your customer base is probably the single most important thing in this kind of environment. And one of the things where it can help, and taking it down to nitty-gritty, is things like AI actually start to have an impact in terms of managing your supply chains. For example, one of the things that we do is if there's an earthquake or there's a fire or something like that, having a base of suppliers that you have to see which supplier is likely to be impacted by an earthquake and developing second sources for it that are readily available. These are tools that wouldn't be available, say, 20, 25 years ago. Right now, you can get them readily in terms of with the access to the information and the analytics capability that we have, whether it's predictive AI, which is largely where a lot of this realm falls into, or things around that nature. So developing the alternative supply chains becomes far more important in this environment, and being prepared for it in light of the geopolitical tensions is what's going to define the truly great organizations from the ones that are average or mediocre in this kind of environment.
And so your suggestion is that every region needs to be treated as a silo? Or?
Not necessarily. I mean, for example, right, we are now today looking at a world that's largely split into two major chains, right? There's the rest of the world, which is sort of okay with supply chains outside of, say, China as it exists today. And China, which largely wants a China-only manufacturing, or as much as possible, a China-only manufacturing strategy. So being cognizant of that and being able to support those divergent models is important. Now, down the pike, do I see countries like India wanting to develop their own self-sufficient model? Yes. Do I see Europe wanting to develop its own self-sufficient model? Yes. But you have to understand that at the end of the day, is there sufficient end demand in those markets to warrant developing a supply chain? I don't know. right? But for the two major blocks, yes, there is sufficient demand. But as you start segmenting it further, is there sufficient end demand to justify setting up capacities in each of those regions? Very hard to tell. And, a decade or so from now, we'll probably have a better idea of the paths we're taking.
So I would love to get your insights on this, Sailesh. What's the impact of a nation that decides not to be self-sufficient and depend on the other major countries? What's the impact on if they don't consider being self-sufficient?
But I don't think there's true self-sufficiency in the semiconductor industry, no matter which way you look at it, right? No nation owns all the raw materials that are needed. No nation can have all the chemicals and specialty gases that are needed for it. They're going to be reliant on other regions for support. So then it becomes a question of, are you a part of a friendly bloc that can get you everything that you need? Or are you sort of still dependent on some hostile actor for getting what you need for the industry? And I think what you may end up happening is a friendly bloc and a not so friendly bloc kind of environment that'll kind of dictate what ends up happening. So for example, right, today, Japan, in terms of specialty chemicals, in terms of substrates, high-end substrates, and in terms of specialty gases, is still the leader. It's going to be very hard to replace the decades and decades of experience that's there, right? Sure, China is going to have some of it, but it'll take a long time. So similarly, right, even on the EV side, you have lithium being one of the major targeted areas in terms of where things are going. So I think it'll fall into two major buckets. A group of friendly countries that align fairly closely to make themselves successful. And then another set that wants to be self-sufficient at all costs. And that's what you're sort of seeing today, right? But each of the regions being self-contained on their own, I don't think that'll happen, at least not in my lifetime, in terms of what I see. Because the raw materials onwards, building it all the way vertically means you have sufficient end demand to warrant that kind of thing. And the part of the equation that's being missed is the end demand.
How does that impact? I mean, surely there'll be a massive impact on the innovation side.
Of course.
If you're going to behave in that manner, and we spoke about this just before this discussion, is that, the reason why Trump has an issue with China, specifically Huawei, for example,
right,
is that Huawei provides a solution that is better, faster, cheaper.
Correct.
So from that perspective, he's shot them in the leg to try to be better, so they can only be faster and cheaper. So when you look at other nations that are kind of in this friendly block mode, what is your perspective if they were to try and achieve all three methods of better, faster, and cheaper? How do they leverage the hostile perspectives? Let's say India, for example. I think India's got incredible workforce talent, workforce development, and it could do something really huge in innovation if it plays its game right with being neutral with China and neutral with Japan and neutral with America. What else is there that's missing to help a country like India to say, right, I want to step into this game. I want to be advanced in semiconductor manufacturing. How do I become better, faster, and cheaper?
Yeah, and I think the challenge for India in particular, and probably seeing this closer than most, I'd say the biggest problem really is the reason China was successful, right, was in part they had the end demand. They went after the OEM market in particular. They targeted the telecommunications and the communications infrastructure as being a vital area. I look at India today, sure, there's Reliance Jio, sure, there's Airtel, and sure, there's a few other telecom companies. The problem is, where is the hardware framework and where is the software architecture that is needed to support that kind of growth, right? So most countries where you'll find and China is probably one of the better examples, and Taiwan certainly is an example where you've got Changhua Telecom doing whatever it needs to do in that area. But If you really look at it, right, the piece that's missing is getting the component guys, the box builders, and the system guys all aligned that you need to drive domestic content growth. In China, if the government suggests something, it's a mandate, okay? For most other countries, it's a nice to have, right? And therein lies the challenge of getting everybody aligned, right? And part of the reason why even in the US side, we had challenges with some of the rural infrastructure carriers is because they let in cost be the overarching stuff. Now they're scrambling back and saying, get all of these because this is a risk in your telecommunications strategy. But that's the part is there has to be alignment, right? Similar to leadership, there has to be alignment from component level to the box build level, to the system level, to the service provider level. And oftentimes in their hurry to catch up at the service provider level, you're willing to get there faster. You're forsaking a lot of these things along the way. And if it's not well thought out, that could happen. Yeah.
I don't want to go straight into geopolitics straight away. I still want to, drill in a little bit in your leadership strategies, because geopolitics, we could do another episode very comfortably on this.
Sure.
But again, I mean, of course, thank you for your insights on that. Remarkable. Sailesh, what's the toughest decision you've ever made as a leader, and what did you learn from it, if you could share?
Yeah, I mean, look, if any leader tells you letting go of people is not the toughest decision one makes in their life, they're probably absolutely lack empathy, lack sympathy, and lack humanity, right? To me, the toughest decisions are those where you make decisions that impact people's lives. And to me, the takeaway lesson is there's two times people remember you in the course of their career. One is how you welcome them on board, and the time that you let people go out of the organization. Those are the two times that people will remember you for a long time to come. If you handle both of those humanely, you handle both of them with dignity, you as a leader would have done everything in your power to manage an organization as effectively as possible. People often forget one or both of them. When you welcome a person into an organization, how you make them feel welcome, your onboarding process and how you treat them, and then we let them go when you treat them with dignity and we treat them with respect, that's what people remember. And that's what they'll always remember as a hallmark of leadership. So, yeah.
Wow, that's deep. That is very deep. Marvelous, really. That's very unique. With over 80 patents to your name.
Right.
Evidently, you've been clearly in the forefront of innovation. So what excites you about the future of semiconductor technology then?
Look, we're in the early innings of the AI and generative AI as things stand today. And kudos to the GPU folks for getting us along in this journey, right? Whether it's NVIDIA largely and the vision that Jensen had on CUDA and enabling getting CUDA out there ahead of everybody else. I think we're still in the early innings. I think the next phase of growth for us is how two areas in particular that I think would define a lot of what ends up happening. One is medical electronics, including flexible electronics, if you will, because the main thing is, well, people talk about, robots or automatons or whatever taking over and ruling the world. I've listened to multiple talks in those lines. I think essentially the first phase is going to be, how does it complement your life? How does it make your life better, right? And I think that's one area. So personalized healthcare is going to be hugely important. The second thing is, how does AI, which today is largely a server arena, come and play itself from an inference perspective to the endpoint or to where the device end of things? the application for that, where it touches the consumer more on a day in and day out basis, and how it shapes things is going to be hugely important. Yeah, there have been several efforts around the AR, VR glasses and this and that, which haven't gone too far, and I don't think they will. But there will be use cases that will develop. And I mean, some of those are more on the enterprise side today, like Copilot and so on, where you use it. But you can start seeing where things like natural language processing, the translation and so on, start to play a much, much bigger role in terms of what happens, right? And it could be something that complements your life to make it a heck of a lot better than it is today. And so I view personalized healthcare as being a huge factor that will determine, touches the consumer at the end of the day. I mean, you can imagine, right, someday in the future, where if you have a clogged artery, you have a little widget that runs a micro machine that runs up and clears it all the time instead of a darn stent, and runs in a battery or something and makes things happen. Now, it's not there yet, but it could, right? Or something that's targeted for destroying cancer cells very specifically, that's very localized. Some of that is happening. But those are the kinds of things, and on the other side, diagnostics, that make a huge bit of difference. And then AI for industrial applications is hugely important. I mean, for example, some of these huge machines, if they break down, it takes you, weeks to fix. Yeah. If you can use AI to predict, hey, maybe changing this filter or changing something along those lines to make things happen, that's a practical application. Now, that's not generative AI, but it's AI that's being applied at a regular level. The challenge really is those markets are fragmented. And how do you approach fragmented markets is going to be one of the challenges that we have to unravel as an industry overall, right? So I don't, look, at the end of the day, I don't think making technologies easier is one element of the challenge. But, one of the most profound quotes that I actually heard was from Edward Wilson, who is, one of the world's famous naturalists and persons that's contributed most to the environment, if you will, is kind of considered the follower to Charles Darwin. And what he ended up saying was, the problem for humanity, right, is we have emotions of the Paleolithic era. We have institutions that are medieval, and we have technologies that are godlike. And that was so profound, right? Very profound. That you really start to kind of understand, if the goal of science is to create a better human being as opposed to making lives easier, we'd be probably in a better place.
Creation. Well, then now there's ministers of AI now, apparently. So they're going to communicate with one another. That'd be interesting. That's AGI, that is, my goodness. Sailesh, on a personal side,
yeah,
you served on global boards across the US,
right,
Europe, and Asia.
Yep.
How do you maintain balance in your life? I mean, it was such a demanding schedule. I mean, they say, happy wife, happy life.
Exactly. That's very true. That is certainly true. I can vouch for that.
Do you do it?
No, so I mean, look, I think it's a question of, again, maintaining your value systems and your beliefs to align with what you want to get done, right? If you truly, I mean, and I mean, this sounds trite, but if you truly enjoy what you're doing, right, then it becomes that much more fun and enjoyment as opposed to a drag, right? When stress comes into your life, when things become a drag, honestly. So if you can maintain the fun, to me, part of being on the board is mentoring the new generation of leaders, of being able to provide them counsel in terms of where things are headed, and then seeing them implement it and getting the results, right? That's fulfilling. When you're fulfilled in what you do, then regardless of the number of tasks you're performing, you'll actually have a fairly healthy and a balanced perspective in terms of what has to happen. Once things start becoming a drag, is when you really...
Andre, I mean, are there any, personal habits or routines that keep you grounded and keep you performing at such a high level?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, to me, solitude, nature walks are important. The other important thing is I do yoga every morning. I'll say, yeah. So I spend a little bit of time doing that. I can't say I'm a professional by any stretch of the imagination, but I spend at least 15 minutes or so doing yoga and some meditation when I get up during the day. And then the rest of it is kind of falls into place. The natural tendency for a lot of people as soon as they get up is to look at their phone. I would suggest your life would be better off if you spend some time on quiet contemplation before you start the day to kind of get you that perspective that you need in terms of what
the rest comes in, right?
Yeah.
Of course, the semiconductor industry, of course, has faced unprecedented challenges in recent years. I mean, the supply chain crisis, as we can imagine, of course, the geopolitical tensions as well. Surprisingly, from the business that I've managed to run, and I see it replicated with all our members, because if we're doing well, that means the industry is doing well. If the industry is doing bad, we're going to be doing bad. Right. It's happened to be like a J curve. It was kind of just like this, and then the pandemic came, and our business and everyone else associated with us, with our association, up like no tomorrow. How have those challenges pretty much shaped your vision with your situation when you at Renesas in those specific periods of times, and the industry at large per se?
Yeah, I'd say during the pandemic, you couldn't supply enough material if your life depended on it, right? And the problem really was we were a supply constrained environment. And the problem is we didn't really have a good perspective on what was the real demand and what wasn't. And I think right now the reality is sort of setting in place that, it's still a cyclical industry, and what we're dealing with is a classical inventory problem. And until the inventory burns itself out, we're not going to be in a situation where the demand recovery essentially happens. But the other factor that complicated things, from my perspective, during this cycle was going into the downturn, going into the pandemic. China pretty much knew they were going to be stuck with all kinds of export restrictions, right, or supply of components into their end markets, and they were a big consumer of what ended up happening. While they stockpiled stuff, coming out of it, they used that time to develop their own internal industry and their capability. So there's been a double whammy. I mean, in a sense, one is this traditional inventory correction, and the other thing is a portion of that market that you thought existed before the pandemic no longer exists now. So the ability to close on that is something the industry, I still believe, hasn't fully come to terms with on how to deal with it. And it's not just at the component level. They've developed domestic areas like for washing machines, dryers, and so on. You have companies like Haier, you have other companies that are all over the place developing their industry. And then you look at the electric vehicle market. They're the leaders globally in terms of what's happening, whether it's BYD, whether it's XPeng, or whether it's whoever the case may be, right? So I think the reality that the traditional players who had access to the China markets no longer do, right? And I think that's a reality that'll play itself out. And although the automotive market, is only about 10% of the semiconductor or so consumption, right? Today, the same holds true for other markets like smartphones and so on, where Huawei's developing its own apps processors and its own modems and its whatever the case may be.
I mean, the two key things that stand out for me with all of these challenges that you're definitely seeing for sure is sustainability and energy efficiency.
Yeah.
And I think that, when you look at the, let's say, end user application perspective, they've all put certain timeframes for net zero perspectives, right?
Yeah.
I've seen a problem in the semiconductor industry, and the problem is more so associated with the subfab section. And the perspective of the, let's say, aside from the abatements and these type of systems, for example, but the toxicity that comes out of it is unbelievable. And then you got to look at the energy efficiency element associated with data centers now, etc. How much they consume is a massive problem. What role do you see the semiconductor companies playing in this area?
I mean, I think I'm encouraged, but by the same token, I think we have a long journey ahead of us. I mean, there's certain major smartphone providers who shall remain nameless that basically are requiring their suppliers to get to net zero kind of conditions in a relatively short order, if you will. And I think the more the end customer and us as consumers start demanding that corporations behave much more, if you will, ethically, for lack of a better word, although I think more sustainably, if you will, I think the more potent effect it's going to have. And I think regulations along those lines by governments for a sustained period of time will make a big difference. Obviously, government changes can impact some of that relative to what happens, but on a long-term basis, as long as there is a consistent view that we need to do better for the environment, whether it's by way of energy consumption or through green energy, if you will, is going to be the right way to go. And most companies are starting to look at it. And look, ultimately, I'm still an optimist. I think, perhaps carbon capture technologies will get sophisticated enough that we may in our lifetimes actually see benefit from some of that. Although the semiconductor industry also is, the other point is huge consumer of water, right?
Yes.
Which is a scarce resource. And while recycling and stuff has its benefits, we're still not at 100% recycling across the board in terms of what has to happen. So that's something that needs to be looked at.
No, marvelous. This is, again, I could go into another episode with this discussion. But I mean, to wrap up this wonderful discussion with yourself, Sailesh, is, what would you like your legacy to be within the semiconductor industry? How would you like to be remembered?
Well, look, I think legacy is a word which means my career is over. It's not yet. I think...
long live Sailesh, long live Sailesh, long live Sailesh.
But no, look, I think at the end of the day, develop the next generation of leaders that will power the semiconductor industry and develop a set of leaders that act ethically, act responsibly, and help foster this great industry of ours to its next phase of growth and success. If we do that, then I think I will have done my job more than anything else.
You've definitely impacted myself, Silas. And for young professionals aspiring to be leaders in the semiconductor industry out there, what advice would you give them?
I mean, I think the best advice I could give is stay curious and stay hungry, right? I would say stay curious, stay hungry. And I think Steve Jobs said it best. He said, you cannot connect the dots in your journey until you're reaching the very end point, right? And it's important to understand, you may take a series of side steps in your career. No career is a vertical straight line all the way to the top. It'll be a series of steps that you're going to take. And as long as you remember that and use every opportunity given to you as a learning opportunity, you'll be incredibly successful. Don't be motivated by your destination. Focus on the journey. If you can focus on the journey, you'll be usually successful.
Very profound. And I mean, it's like, what's one thing about you that people often misunderstand or estimate?
I would say, look, part of leadership is public speaking. And just because, when I give a talk or something like that in front of audience several times, hundreds or thousands of people as the case may be, people think that you're naturally an extrovert. I'm a terrible introvert. I don't like to socialize. I don't like to, get out there and mingle and do major social activities. So, and that's not being a snob or anything like that. It's just the natural desire to go into the shell or the cocoon so that I can come out again and talk about things or elaborate. So I think that's probably the biggest misunderstanding that people have. So.
I did not know. Good. I mean, just to wrap up this marvelous podcast again, thank you, Sailesh, for your time. We have a tradition on the show where the last guest leaves a question for the next guest. The last guest has left you this question. What is the one challenge that you're facing right now that keeps you awake at night, and how are you tackling it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the biggest challenge we all face, right, collectively, is how do we leave a better future for those who are in the earlier phase of the journey, right? To us and to me personally, I think if we can leave a better future for our kids and the generations that follow, that I think is the single most important thing. If we can mentor or we can create the kind of environment that makes the generations that follow us think of us in a new light, like, for example, the greatest generation was widely respected, right? And they were the silent generation. If we can recreate that for our kids to know that we've inspired them for a better future, then I think that's a legacy, if you will. That's a legacy we can all be proud of.
Sailesh, thank you for your time. Thank you for this wonderful discussion on the Semiconductor Leadership Podcast. To anybody listening out there, I hope you've taken enough notes of this wonderful discussion. A lot of profound comments, as always, from deep down my heart. Sailesh, thank you for everything you've done for me, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your career. And I'm always in debt. And to end the discussion, I'm going to pass you on my iPad so you can write down a question for the next person on the show.
So first and foremost, thank you, Salah. I mean, I know we've known each other for over a decade now. And it's great what you're doing with ISIS, and I'm certainly looking forward to Chapter 2.0 as a part of this journey. So my gratitude, and especially as we enter the holiday season, right, I'm filled with nothing but gratitude for the fact that we're working in an industry that has the ability to shape a lot of things that happen in the world around us, right? People take it for granted, but to be a part of this journey has been a phenomenal experience. With that, the question I would have for guests that follow is really 5 to 10 years from now, and I'd say more in the 10-year horizon. How many of these self-reliant nations that are trying to achieve self-sufficiency in semiconductors will be successful, and which ones do you think are likely to succeed in the next decade at achieving their mission of self-reliance and self-sufficiency? That would be the question that I would have. But again, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
My pleasure.